You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast. Today, I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Daniel Coupland of Hillsdale College. Over the years, Dan's been a leading advocate for the renewal of classical education, beginning as a teacher and then as a professor. He's an author and an eloquent spokesperson for classical. Dan has led the way by example. Numerous teaching awards, he has a consistent commitment to teachers, and this is revealing a central passion. He loves teaching and mentoring teachers. One of the first to provide intellectual support to the Great Hearts Institute and a good dose of encouragement to me personally. I can attest to the fact that Dan is reliable. He's always there, and he's always there with insight as to where we are and where we're headed. Dan, I am so thankful that you're here today to join us.
Rob, it's a pleasure to join the podcast, and it's good to have, just a decent conversation with a good friend.
Thanks, Dan. We're going to get around to your work at Hillsdale and the deanship that you now possess as the dean of the Masters in Classical Education. But I'd really like to go back a bit. And if you could, tell us how you got involved with this movement that we call classical.
Yeah, thanks. When I was in college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I could see myself doing a wide variety of things. And in my junior year of college, it was actually my dad who proposed the idea of me potentially, being a teacher. I thought he was crazy. I could see myself doing a lot of things, but teaching wasn't one of them. As is often the case, he was right. Upon graduating from college in 1994, I did what most people, do who want to go into teaching. I looked around at the local public school, and I'd completed a teacher preparation program. And so I secured a job at a public school just north of Detroit as a high school Spanish teacher, and really enjoyed it. Had a wonderful experience and really fell in love, not just with teaching, but with the idea of education itself. So around 5 years later, in 1999, I went back to school to pursue a doctoral degree in the field of education, and went to a major research university. And it didn't take me long to become really disillusioned with the field of education itself. It was amazing to me how much time we spent talking about things other than teaching and learning. And it was a little bit of a disappointment. And so while a grad student, and this goes to your question, while a grad student, I had assigned reading in class, and some of the readings were good, some of them were a little bit off base, but I began my own intellectual inquiry, and I began actually stumbled across a book that led to another book that led to another one, and then to an author, then to a speaker, and then to a conference. And I would say that I began really getting involved in classical education when around 2001 is when that journey began. And that led to me, joining the faculty here at Hillsdale College in 2006. So between 2001 and 2006, that was kind of my transition into classical education. And I'm just grateful that I was able to find a place like Hillsdale College that is committed to classical education. And I've been working here at the college ever since, and been able to work with people inside the college, but also people outside the college like yourself and our friends and colleagues around the classical education movement. And that's my journey to classical education.
Do you remember, Dan, what one of those first or second books you described, kind of going down the rabbit hole into classical, so to speak? What were a couple of those early volumes that got your attention?
All right, so I'm going to probably be way more specific than you would ever want.
No, please.
So believe it or not, as a grad student, my parents were living in Florida at the time, and I was down in Florida again. Kind of discouraged with what I was experiencing in the world of education. And I was walking around, my parents' house, and I went into my dad's library, and I pulled a book off the shelf, and it made reference, or it kept on quoting this guy named John Milton Gregory, who was making these comments about teaching, and the book that he was quoted in was okay, but the quotes of John Milton Gregory were just right on, and I thought, this guy gets, this guy gets education. This guy gets teaching and learning. This is the kind of guy that I want to meet. So I thought, I got to meet this guy, John Milton Gregory, only to discover that he wrote those words that I read in the 7 Laws of Teaching in the mid 1800s.
Yep.
Actually 1880s, and so he had long since deceased. But that book, led to the 7 Laws of Teaching. I discovered the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and they use that book, and they have some great materials that helped me and led me to other books around the same time. I began reading Victor Davis Hanson, his book, Who Killed Homer, which was just a really interesting book for me. And that book led to other books, and ultimately, led me to pursue and want to be working with people who had these ideas, these very old ideas about education.
We're going to include Gregory on our show notes here for this podcast, because I think it's always fascinating, Dan. You never know quite how folks are going to be introduced, but there are a handful of those older authors that really do just sing the song. I mean, they're inspired. They are,
that's right.
They're truly inspired. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Now, as we think about teaching today, and K-12 education in particular, I'm interested, just as you described your experience in the late 90s and the early noughts, what the challenges are for those who are teaching, specifically if they're moving, as you did, towards the classical method. What are going to be the challenges they face if they want to come into and really a full appreciation of a classical approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can describe my experience. I can describe the experience of other people who were working in or are working in the field of education. And it's really interesting. My own experience as a public school educator was one of frustration in this way, that I had received a great education. My parents had done a very good job of making sure, that I had a good education. I went to public school. I went to private school. I was homeschooled for a short period of time, and they were really committed to my education. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that they saw themselves as the primary educators, for me and my 2 older sisters. So although there wasn't anything, I didn't have a list. I didn't understand, the philosophy, the anthropology behind the education I received. There was a remnant that was left, a heritage, if you will, from the education that I received, so that when I went to teach in a classroom in a public school, I tried to bring those features of the quality education I had received into my own classroom. But what I noticed was that the structure, the institution, what I call the education establishment, was not in sync with that, and was often working against that. And what that led to, and I referred to my own frustration as a teacher, what that led to was me closing the door in my classroom and trying to do the best I could for my students. Again, informed in my own understanding about the content itself, but also drawing from my own experience of what I knew at almost a guttural level about what education was. So I'm closing my door and trying to do that for my students. But that's a frustrating experience of trying to do that and feeling as though the system itself, the establishment itself, is working against you. Mostly in small ways, mostly in kind of um, um, uh, non-direct, indirect ways, slowly working against you. And so I experienced that frustration. And I would imagine that there are other educators out there who are maybe working in a local public school or are working in a private or a charter school that draws from a different tradition or a newer or to use a loaded term, a progressive tradition
Mhm.
in which they know at a guttural level that what they're asked or what they're being asked to do is not education. It's
Mm.
something other than that. And what I discovered in classical education, and I think that many educators who are coming into classical education will discover themselves, is that classical education draws from a tradition, a very, very old tradition
Mhm.
um, of education. As a graduate student in the field of education, I was amazed because it seemed like education, and this is an overstatement, but at least within the ed school, I almost got the sense that education and what we know about education began with John Dewey.
Mm.
And then everything else after that, he was kind of the origin of quality education. And what I discovered in classical education is that actually we know something about education, and we've known about it for a very, very long time.
Mhm.
Um, and that progressive education is kind of the fad, I would say,
Mm.
and that
Mm.
classical education is not a fad. And anytime anyone says, classical education, that's kind of the next new thing. No, it's actually the old thing. And that
Mm.
doesn't mean that it can't apply innovations. After all, I mean, I'm speaking to you on a computer using technology and all of
Sure.
that. So it's not as if we reject those things, but the core, the philosophy behind the ideas are very, very old.
Mm.
And they deal with the most important things, that education is more than just the acquisition of information and the cultivation of the intellect. And it's more than just preparation for the world of work or preparation for a particular economy. Now, the intellect and skills and job skills, all of those things are important. But what classical education also points out is the idea that those things uh, are misguided or can be misguided if you don't also address what we say the heart. So it's the head, the hands, in
Mhm.
terms of the intellect and the skills. But if you're missing the heart, you're really missing the core elements of what it means to be classically educated,
Mhm.
because the heart matters, character matters as well.
Mhm. As you're saying this, Dan, I'm thinking to myself, perhaps we can reach a broader audience in part by tapping into the sort of felt needs, as they're referred to, recognizing that children, young people, and their parents are concerned about children's fullness, their happiness, right? But we, as you're referencing, have a tradition that stems back millennia that speaks to what truly makes the human happy, how humans flourish. And perhaps we have an opportunity to bring that to a broader audience if we can rhetorically adjust ourselves a bit and say, happiness, flourishing, is that what you're interested in? We've got that. We've got that here, and a perennial philosophy that will address those felt needs.
Yeah,
But I
I would
see,
agree.
go
I
ahead.
would agree with you on that. And what's interesting is that you don't have to be a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle to be involved or to care about classical education or want that for children. But I am amazed how many people become interested in classical education when you have your own, when you begin to have your own children,
Mhm.
or when you have grandchildren, or when you have nieces and nephews. When education becomes personal in terms of the young people that you know, and you need to make hard decisions about what really matters in education, it forces you to begin to ask fundamental questions. I told you that I became interested in classical education and to pursue it around 2001. It's not a coincidence that my eldest child was actually born in 2001. So again, you can look at education in terms of a field of study, in terms of an intellectual activity or exercise. But when you begin to have your own children or children around you who you care about, and you need to be making these fundamental decisions about what education really is, it's amazing how many people at that point discover classical education, because it's meeting those kind of fundamental needs that people have or desire in education.
Oh, so true. So true. Now, for those like your earlier self, and my journey perhaps in some ways mirrors your own, having come in through a school of education, a Research One university and so forth. But in as much as I was pursuing and you were pursuing and trying to understand this classical approach, let's assume there's someone else out there who's investigating, perhaps for the first time, what this model, this approach looks like. What recommendations do you have besides Gregory for them to
Mm.
really deepen their understanding and how to really get a grasp on what is classical? Where should they go?
Yeah, so I I I think there are a lot of different things, and I'll offer a few recommendations. But I think one of the early steps that people need to make is to go visit a school.
Mhm,
There
mhm,
are, because schools are human led, and humans are involved in all of their complexity. It's very hard to come up with a specific list of what a school needs to have. You need to have this, 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 and this. They're complex.
mhm,
Human beings are involved, so it's going to be complex. So what that means is you need to experience a classical education in practice in its fullness. Again, understanding that some schools are better than others, and some are going to offer a better education than others. But I think step one is to go and visit a school.
mhm,
There's so many times where I walk into a classical school, and there's just a palpable difference in the way that the students look, in the way the students act, how they're asked to act, the kinds of things that they're reading, the kinds of things they're talking about and they're doing, again, their expectations. To be able to see it, you will immediately recognize this is a different approach to education. This is a richer, a fuller, a deeper kind of education.
mhm,
So
mhm.
step one is to go visit a school. There are plenty of classical schools.
Yep.
I'm around. I'm sure you are able to recommend some. I absolutely can. And it doesn't take too much work to be able to find a well-functioning classical school, to see it actually in practice. Beyond that, I would pursue people who are interested in this. As I said, there are plenty of people out there who are just coming into classical education, or have heard about it in a news report or a newspaper article, or online or something like that. Look for other people who are interested in the same kinds of things, and begin to get in conversation. You'll find those people in your community. You'll find them, as parents, in the bleachers, at a club sporting event. You'll find them at your church. People who are interested in offering the best education they can for the children in their lives, and begin to converse with them. Begin to read things. Begin to talk about those things. Start a book club. Start
Mhm.
reading great books, about classical education, and begin to have that conversation. It won't take long before, again, just like my experience, just like your experience, that one conversation will lead to another, one book will lead to another, and I think that's the best way to get into the field of classical education, and to learn more about it.
Wonderful suggestion. And again, for show notes, we will include that map that the Great Arts Institute has produced. We've got almost 900 schools coast to coast that identify as classical. So anyone who's really interested or starting to get interested should take a look at those. And as you said, drop in, see the difference, feel the difference inside the school. So important. Now, you and your colleagues at Hillsdale College have just launched a master's in classical education. This is interesting because, as you just said, your graduate school experience in education was, well, not very classical. So,
Right.
how would you then distinguish, right? Make some distinctions here about a typical graduate degree in education and what you are offering. What are the unique features of that master's in classical education?
Yeah, thanks for that. Here at Hillsdale College, we do not offer a major at the undergraduate level in education. We want our undergraduates to be well grounded in a particular field of study. It could be the field of study that they're eventually going to teach. So, for example, if a student wants to be a chemistry teacher, we would want them to pursue a degree in chemistry or something in
Mhm.
science to be prepared for that. Now, we do offer courses at the undergraduate level to help people make the transition from the undergraduate into a classroom. That said, at the graduate level, we have wanted to open up a graduate program because, as you well know, and anyone who is watching this or hearing this podcast will know, that the thing that is needed in the world of classical education more than anything is good people, good leaders in particular. And when I say leaders, I don't just mean school administrators. I mean leadership at almost every level. Lead teachers in the lower school, curriculum authors, people working in public policy, so that if classical education is going to thrive in America and internationally, we need the kind of support in terms of professional journals, in terms of think tanks like the Great Heart Institute, in terms of colleges being involved in this. And we have wanted to contribute to that in a big way by helping to prepare leaders. And the best way that we can do that is by offering a graduate school of classical education. So
Mhm.
Hillsdale just launched it's a Master of Arts in Classical Education program. We have our first cohort on campus right now, and they're completing their first year, and we're already going through applications for year two.
Mm.
How we differ to a typical graduate program in classical education is that we go back to the beginning. Our graduate program is a 2-year residential program where we want people to come here to Hillsdale and we want them to immerse themselves in the culture created, here at Hillsdale College. In the first year of the program, we have 3 strands that go across the entire year. So our graduate students come in as a cohort. We only admit students, the fall of the year. They come in and they take courses, all their courses together that first year,
Mm.
and it's 3 strands. One strand of history, one of philosophy, and then one of humane letters across the entire year. And this is giving our students the opportunity to look at education from a historical lens, a philosophical lens, but also a humane letters lens in terms of reading great literature and
Mhm.
reading poetry. And so in that way, all of our grad students are getting a solid foundation of being able to answer the fundamental questions about what is education. It's interesting, in a lot of graduate programs in the field of education, you're already thrust into the technical aspects of education. Here's how you do education. But here at Hillsdale, we want to start with the foundation, a historical, a philosophical, a literature kind of a base, so that our students know what education really is. Then in the second year, our students are able to draw from that first year experience, and then be able to make a few more choices in terms of, if someone wants to go into school administration, we have school administration classes.
Mm.
If someone just wants to emphasize curriculum in a pedagogy, well, then we'll offer those experiences as well. If someone wants to to be prepared for further graduate work in the field of classical education or a related field, we're going to offer them courses in the tradition, allowing them to take courses in Augustine, in Aquinas, in the Inklings, courses in the Trivium, the Quadrivium. So giving them more of an intellectual, foundation in the tradition. The most obvious kind of a difference between our program and most programs in the field of education is that we believe and we ground our program in a tradition older than the 1900s. And so it's grounded, as you said, in 2 millennia plus tradition of great ideas. And we ground our students in that as we get them ready to go forth and work in the field of classical education.
What's so wonderful to hear is that you've brought history and a review of where we've been educationally over 2,500 years or so with a philosophic analysis, but then something of the humanity or the humanistic aspect in humane letters, which permits them to understand that these principles and certainly these first things must be embodied, right? That they are to be lived out. And I think that's probably one of the great strengths of this humane letters element that you've introduced, and would be quite attractive. What are some of the favorites? Are you teaching in that humane letters track as well?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Actually, as a dean, I kind of coordinate, the first year experience, and I meet with the graduate students every week, and I actually introduce them to leaders within the classical education movement. We have people come to campus, or we have them, broadcast in. In fact, I was very grateful that you were willing to speak to our graduate students
Happy to.
last semester, and we had probably 10 to 12 other leaders within classical education speak to our graduate students, and that was a real pleasure, and that is an ongoing experience. So while they're having the kind of the intellectual experience in the classes, we're also introducing them to the wider world of classical education. I often say that I'm introducing tomorrow's leaders to today's leaders, the people who are actually doing the work. So I'm not teaching here in the first year. In the second year, I will be teaching a course called Curriculum and Pedagogy of Classical Education. And the idea there is okay, let's take what we learned in the first year in terms of history, in terms of philosophy and literature and poetry and all of these great letters. Now let's apply that to what's going on in schools today. If we have this understanding about what education is, how does that inform our practice? How does that inform what we do and how we do it? So it is a practical class, but I'm going to be drawing from that first year of experience that our students have going through the program. So I look forward to that.
Wonderful. You've been at this, as you just told us, for well over 15 years, and really the journey for the past 25. If you review these past couple of decades of classical education, would you think with us for just a little bit about the primary needs and even the ongoing concerns that we must address if classical is to flourish in America?
Yeah. So like any worthy project, we're going to face challenges, and we are facing them on a daily basis. In fact, those people who are doing the noble work of greeting students every morning at 7:30 in the morning, they'll be able to tell you a long list of challenges that they face on a daily basis. It's nice to be able, from my position to reflect on it, and I'll give you 3 here, that I see as kind of important challenges. Number one is that the issue of students with special needs. If it is true that classical education is the best education, and as Adler would say, the best education for some is the best education for all. How do we provide this truly best education to students who who have special challenges in their
Mhm.
learning. And I think Cheryl Lowe has done a lot of great work, thinking about this and training teachers. And there's some noble people out in schools who are trying to answer this question on a daily basis. So I would say challenge, number one would be students with special needs or special challenges. Challenge number two would be students who are coming from perhaps underprivileged backgrounds. They're perhaps coming out of an experience, out of homes where maybe language is not as prevalent, quality language, access to books, access to materials. And so having a student come into then a classical school that's asking students to read at a high level and to engage intellectually at a pretty high level to try to help those students who maybe do not have any cognitive challenges, but just they haven't been exposed to language and to ideas and stories. And how do we get them up to speed, and how do we be able to provide them with a quality classical education? So that's a big challenge. And then I'd say number three is that we're getting inquiries well beyond the borders of our country. In the last year, I've been interacting with people in South Korea, in Brazil, in Africa, in China. And so what do we do in the context beyond the United States? And I'll even go further. The movement of classical education is a decidedly Western tradition, and a lot of the ideas come out of the Western tradition. But as those in the East become more and more interested in classical education, how do we preserve what makes classical education good, and yet be able to, as again Mortimer J. Adler hinted at in his book How to Read a Book, that there is an Eastern tradition, and there are ideas, and actually C.S. Lewis talked about this in The Abolition of Man as well, is that there are ideas within those non-Western tradition that are consistent with many of the principles within classical education. And so how do we give what is good about Western classical education and honor what is good from those non-Western traditions, and be able to ultimately provide students with a quality education. So I would say special education, students coming from perhaps an underprivileged background, and then the international challenge, for lack of a better term. I see those as three things that we as classical education or classical educators are going to have to keep our eyes on.
As always, Dan, you are spot on to be able
Mm.
to address the needs of those with the greatest need, but also to have that vision for something that is truly cosmopolitan, but in the best sense of that term, something that reaches beyond the borders of any particular nation, but with something that is deeply classical. I was reminded, and you will recall from last year's symposium, our opening plenary was led by Frederick Turner of the University of Texas at Dallas, whose comments were drawn in large measure from his own experience, not only as a poet and a humanist, but from a family of anthropologists, in fact, world renowned anthropologists. And his book, Culture of Hope, speaks to this very thing, a classical spirit, a new birth of the classical spirit that certainly is not to be confined to any one region, any one nation, but is truly human in the best and deepest sense. So I think you hit all three just right, Dan, and I appreciate that trifecta. We are going to wrap it up here. I want to thank you again, Dan, for taking some of your valuable time to be with us, because you're busy authoring books like Tried and True, which we'll have available at the symposium later next month. You're going to be giving a talk or two and a workshop for teachers. So you'll be bringing more of what you've just shared with us today when we gather in Phoenix later in February for the National Symposium. And I look forward to seeing you there, Dan. I really do.
Yeah, I do as well. And it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me, Rob.
All right. We'll talk to you later, Dan.
Yeah, thanks.
Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.